Most people would agree that a parent who throws themselves in front of a train while holding their young child is not behaving normally. But how do we distinguish between someone who was temporarily unable to get out of bed, going through a traumatic divorce, and someone who is suffering from severe depression? Today, you may have gotten out of bed, had breakfast, gone to class, studied, and at the end of the day enjoyed the company of your friends before you went to bed and fell asleep. It probably didn't occur to you that many physically healthy people are unable to do any of those things. What they have in common is a psychological disorder, a psychological dysfunction within the individual that is associated with distress or impairment in functioning and a response that is not typically or culturally expected. So how can we know whether our behavior is normal or abnormal? At what point do our fears, our thoughts, mood changes, and actions move from normal to mentally disturbed? We're going to explore the many psychological disorders, their symptoms, and their possible causes as well as treatments. Let's first ask the obvious question. What is abnormal, and what is abnormal psychology?
Abnormal psychology is a branch of science of psychology that addresses the description, the causes, and the treatment of abnormal behavior patterns. Now, there's various criteria that are used to define abnormal behavior. Psychologists generally consider behavior as being abnormal when it meets some of the combination of the following criteria. So we can begin when we look at abnormal behavior, we can ask several questions. Well, one, is the behavior unusual or infrequent? Two, socially acceptable. Now, or is there a violation of social norms? Like, for example, in the wintertime, I wear shorts all year round. So is violating social norms always unacceptable or a violation in terms of abnormal psychology? Well, think of something that's unusual, such as dressing in a non-conforming way, either in class or in a social gathering, or doing something that's socially unacceptable, such as singing on a bus or eating spaghetti in a restaurant with your fingers. Then go out and do the behavior somewhere. Please don't do anything, that's illegal or contrary to other people's rights. But after you do so, reflect on how difficult it was to carry out the behavior, your feelings about it, the other people's reactions. This is an exercise that usually helps us appreciate the importance of social norms in their existence. Then we can look at the third point. Is the behavior fraught with misconceptions or misunderstandings of reality? And then fourth, does the behavior get associated with states of severe personal distress? Fifth, is the behavior maladaptive or self-defeating? And then lastly, is the behavior dangerous to self or others? Now, these are all the different conditions by which abnormal psychologists use to define what is abnormal. And you can certainly see there's some variations as to whether or not that's really abnormal behavior or whether it's just eccentricities or it's stretching some things. If it doesn't cause personal distress and it's not dangerous, if it's is outside of an interpretation of what is reality, then we might be crossing some lines. So what factors affect our perspective of what is abnormal? Well, the determination of which behavior patterns are deemed abnormal depends on cultural beliefs and those cultural expectations. Concepts of health and illness may have different meanings in different cultures. Abnormal behavior patterns may take different forms in different cultures, and societal views of abnormal behavior may vary across cultures. Behavior considered normal in one culture may be deemed as abnormal in another. You can consider anxiety and depression as examples of how they will vary from culture to culture. We need to consider how people in different cultures experience states of emotional distress, including depression and anxiety, rather than imposing our perspective on them. Failure to recognize cultural differences in what is deemed normal and abnormal behavior can lead to inadequate and inappropriate diagnosis and treatment. Now, in addition, we could also consider the idea of context. Well, in context, is this abnormal? Dressing up or not dressing up and writing "Oh Canada" on your chest in bold letters? Does this deviate from social norms? Well, that depends on where and when the behavior and the attire occurs. What other factors do you think affect the perception of what is abnormal behavior?
So how common are psychological disorders? Well, abnormal behavior affects virtually everyone in one way or another. Abnormal behavior patterns that involve disturbances of the psychological functioning or behaviors are classified as psychological disorders. About 20% of Canadians will suffer from a psychological disorder at some point in their lifetime. So how common are psychological disorders? Let's look at a few. Anxiety disorder affects about 30% of adults in their lifetime. Mood disorders, well, that affects about 20% of adults in their lifetime. Substance abuse disorders affects almost 15% of adults in their lifetime. And if you consider any of the psychological disorders, well, that affects about 46% of adults in their lifetime. It's more common than maybe we first think, and it affects all the people around those of us who may have been diagnosed with a psychological disorder.
So what are the risks around and about developing a psychological disorder? When we consider the risk factors in a major Canadian study on psychological health, Stevens and Dahlberg and Julbert determined that the risk factors can include age, education, childhood trauma, current stresses, life events, social supports, gender, and physical health. These are all different risk factors. Now, what's important about these risk factors isn't just the individual risk factors, in and of themselves, but it's exposure to multiple risk factors that can have an exponential effect and that dramatically increase the likelihood of adverse outcomes. The research suggested that exposure to just two risks can engender a four-fold increase in adverse outcomes. Exposure to four or more risk factors can increase adverse outcomes tenfold. Now, that doesn't mean that every person with two factors or four factors or more will have adverse outcomes. What is a big influence is what's known as resilience. Resilience is the display of positive adaptation in the face of adversity. It's the capacity to bounce back from our lows and learn from them in a positive way. It's the vital sense of flexibility and the capacity to reestablish one's own balance. And so resilience is something that we all have elements of or degrees of. Some have way more resilience, it appears, than others do. And so not all of these experiences of risk are going to translate into something much more health risking. When morbidity and mortality issues are factored into the equation, poor mental health is one of the costliest health conditions in Canada, with the conservative estimate of treatment to be over $14 billion, that's with a B, billion dollars annually. So what we're going to look at is a little bit of the historical view of where abnormal or identifying abnormal behavior and abnormal psychology has come from. Ancient societies attributed abnormal behavior to divine or supernatural forces known as a demonological model. Sorry about that. Stone Age skulls have shown that our prehistoric ancestors practiced turfening. This is where they would cut a hole in a person's skull, and possibly as a means of releasing demons. There are some authorities in ancient times, such as the Greek physicians Hippocrates and Galen, who believed that abnormal behavior related to natural causes. Hippocrates, for example, proposed that abnormal behavior was due to an imbalance of humors or vital fluids, phlegm, black bile, blood, and yellow bile. And those fluids, in excess or in lack of, would cause certain effects on the human behavior. The importance of the theory was that it overshadowed the development of modern medical model of abnormal behavior, by which disorders and diseases are seen as resulting from underlying biological processes. So we carry on and we look into the Middle Ages, and we saw that there was a return to this doctrine of possession, revitalized by the Roman Catholic Church. Exorcisms became a common practice to expel evil spirits or demons from affected individuals. Later, in the beginning of the 15th century, people who displayed abnormal behavior were considered witches. And we move on to the 15th and 16th century. Asylums or madhouses began to crop up throughout Europe in the late 15th and 16th century, often on the site of former leprosariums. This is where people with leprosy were kept. Conditions in these asylums were dreadful, and in some, such as the Bethlehem Hospital in England, a circus atmosphere prevailed. In the Hotel Dieu in Quebec City in 1639, the first asylum in North America, other such places were around at this time. The care was almost non-existent. When the rise of moral therapy in the 19th century began, largely spearheaded by Frenchmen Jean-Baptiste Poussin and Philippe Pinel, conditions in mental hospitals improved. Proponents of moral therapy believed that mental patients could be restored to functioning if they were treated with dignity and understanding. So moral therapy had little to do with an ethical code. Rather, it emphasized treating institutional patients as normally as possible and allowing them to have the opportunity to interact in normal settings, emphasizing learning through social norms. At the same time, this massive immigration of North America was taking place. Canadian activist Dorothea Dix Crusade began to speak out about the conditions in asylums. Appalled by the poor standards in asylums, began what became known as a mental hygiene movement. It wasn't until the middle of the 20th century did public outrage and concern about the plight of mental patients mobilize legalizing efforts toward the development of community mental health centers as alternatives to long-term hospitalization. The Canadian Mental Health Association was established in 1963. This movement towards deinstitutionalization was spurred by the introduction of psychiatric drugs called phenothiazine, which curbed the more flagrant features of schizophrenia. Deinstitutionalization in Canada has resulted in many homeless individuals with mental health issues who got lost in the transition from psychiatric institutions to a largely inadequate community mental health services. In 2007, the federal government announced funding for the Canadian Mental Health Commission in order to implement a national mental health strategy. Now, more current perspectives, when we consider abnormal behavior to be viewed in various contemporary perspectives, the medical model conceptualized abnormal behavior patterns as physical diseases in terms of clusters of symptoms called syndromes, which have distinctive causes that are presumed to be biological in nature, whereas psychological perspectives consider the thinking and mental aspects to explain abnormal behavior. The sociocultural views consider the bigger social context, and the interactionalist perspective has encouraged an interaction of multiple factors, including biological, psychological, sociocultural, and environmental factors. And we'll explore some of these further in part 2. All right, here we are at the end of the first video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and this is a lot like how the videos will carry on for the rest of the semester. Good luck, everybody.